they get sloppy too. And the next thing you know, the cure all is to give them Thorazine. And then they would just, so that didn't work out. But that's what I remember.
One of the things that was clear when the downgrading blew up and the reporting of the downgrade blew up in Philadelphia was the shock and surprise of the advocacy groups. Now, if you go back and you look at what was going on in Fairmont versus what was going on in Center City, up in Fairmont, these community organizations were talking to Ditchkovsky and the police who were out on the street, letting them know what was going on. And if the advocacy groups, if 30% of the rapes were being classified as non-crime, I can't believe that some of those victims weren't trying to reach out and find a node somewhere they could grab onto and get help, because those were big numbers. Those were, we were talking several hundred cases a year, rapes that were being classified as non-crimes. So, not only were the police kind of going to sleep in terms of handling these cases, I'm only half sympathetic to the question, how did we get this bad? But the advocacy organizations were kind of missing the boat as well. And sometimes the interaction between the advocacy groups and the police, I think, gets to be a little bit too cozy. But they get to know each other because they're dealing with a common clientele. I think there just needs to be a healthy dose of skepticism.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you?
I'm doing well, Ray.
This
I'm
season,
looking forward to today's episode.
We here at Cold Red Podcast will be dedicating an entire season to a case that both Fitz and I had the opportunity to work when we were with the FBI. It's called the Center City Rapist, and we've had some very interesting guests that have been directly involved in the case and its aftermath. Today, Fitz and I would like to welcome back retired homicide detective Chuck Boyle and Sylvester Schieber, the father of Shannon Schieber, to help us in discussing the Center City Rapist case. Now, sexual violence is one of the most pervasive and often hidden crises in our society. For nearly 3 decades, RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, has been at the forefront of supporting survivors and driving change. At the heart of its mission is a natural sexual assault hotline, which has connected millions of people to confidential, compassionate support. Today, we're speaking with Megan Cutler, who is the Chief of Victim Services of the RAINN National Network, about the challenges that survivors face, the evolution of the movement against sexual violence, and the role that RAINN continues to play in shaping both personal healing and public policy. Welcome to the show, Megan.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you all for having me. I'm really just glad to be here and talk about this important topic.
Now, when we ended our last show, we were talking about some cases that were out in Fort Collins, Colorado, and we had the opportunity to speak with 2 of the victims on the show, and one by means of a document that she provided to us. But we want to kind of switch gears here a little bit, Megan, and we want to talk about some of the things that you do. But first, I think our audience would like to find out a little bit about you. So if you can, tell us a little bit about your background and what led you down this career path of being and how you elevated yourself to the Chief of Victim Services for RAINN.
Absolutely. So I have spent my entire career really focused on responding to various forms of violence against humans, against people. I started out working for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and I was an advocate, just answering phone calls, text messages, and I talked with survivors of sex and labor trafficking, sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, just really any number of horrific crimes, as well as their family members, friends. And through that work, I also worked quite a bit with law enforcement, whether that was local, state, or federal, as well as local service providers. And so doing that work, I really began to understand, the strength of survivors coming forward and asking for assistance and help, and also what sort of resources and support are available to people who need it, and then also what some of those gaps might be. And so it really drove this passion for me personally about hotlines and hotlines as an anonymous and confidential place for people to get help when they're not sure where to turn. And so that led me to this role at RAINN, where I oversee the National Sexual Assault Hotline, as well as our training function, which gets folks ready to support survivors and their loved ones via the hotline. And then we also have a research and evaluation team that looks at what are the types of things that people share with us in an aggregated and anonymized way via the National Sexual Assault Hotline, so we can better understand how to support survivors and sort of what sexual violence looks like here in the United States. That's my trajectory and how I ended up here with you all today. So this conversation is very relevant to my personal and professional areas of expertise and interest. And so it's been great listening to this podcast and learning from all of you as well. And I think we'll have a great conversation.
If you could, for our listeners, we have listeners from many different countries and all of the United States that may not be familiar with RAINN. Would you kind of give an overview of the organization's mission and what some services that you provide? And are those services available to those that live internationally?
Great questions. RAINN is the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. And like I mentioned, we operate the National Sexual Assault Hotline. We were founded in 1994, so a little bit before the timeline of a lot of what we've spoken about on this podcast. And at the time, the conversation in the anti-sexual violence field was really around, the need for one national number, one place for people to get help. And there wasn't one at that point. And so our founder really understood this challenge and took it as his own to figure out, how do we address this issue? So in partnership with local sexual assault service providers, created the National Sexual Assault Hotline. So we initially started as just telephone, but now we also have an online chat function and text messages, and people can reach us wherever they are, however they are. We are focused on the United States, so folks are not able to reach out to us internationally, although there are lots of other resources internationally for people who've experienced sexual violence. So, we can help people get where they need to be in that respect, but we're focused on the United States. More broadly, outside of just the National Sexual Assault Hotline, RAINN's mission is to stop sexual violence. And we do that by supporting survivors, holding perpetrators accountable, and working to create safer communities. So we do that by changing minds, which is how we talk about prevention and education, changing laws, which is what we talk about with policy, and some of the big picture systemic issues y'all have talked about on this podcast, I think really do dovetail with that policy piece. And then lastly, changing lives, which is providing hope and healing and support via the National Sexual Assault Hotline.
Could you share a moment or a story that really captures the heart of RAINN's work?
Yeah. I think the thing I would talk about and share there is that often the first thing that someone says to us when they reach out via the sexual assault hotline is, I'm not sure, I think I was raped, or what does it mean to be raped? And so we're often that first point of contact when someone is in this stage of contemplation and trying to understand what happened to them. And so it might be before they've told anyone else in their life. It might be before they've reached out to law enforcement to report, if that's something they're choosing to do. It's really in this place where they're trying to understand their experience, and being able to be that first point of support to say, here's what sexual violence is. Here's what rape is. We believe you. We're here for you. You are not alone. Unfortunately, this is not an uncommon experience, and there are ways that you can get help. And I think that as a starting point is just really powerful for building on that place where people can choose later. Do I want to report to law enforcement? Do I want to ask help? Am I ready to share my story in a broader way? And so being that entry point is just a really impactful place to be.
Interesting. Have you noticed a shift in the type of calls you're getting and the messages that are coming in recent years, like a changing of the landscape?
Yeah, I think yes and no. There's these consistent themes of, like I talked about, people maybe not necessarily knowing how to define their own experience, but some changes that we've seen, particularly kind of post-COVID and post-pandemic, are hearing during the height of the pandemic, we heard more and more from children than we ever had before. So that's something that has been an unfortunate but interesting evolution. And then another thing would just be the role of technology. What we talk about is technology-enabled abuse. So whether that's facilitated via the internet, or people have met their abuser online first, or someone sharing non-consensual intimate images of someone else, all of that sort of sexual violence and abuse happening online. We're hearing more and more about that each day. As you all in law enforcement know, there's also just a constant change in the types of technology and apps and tools that people are using to communicate, and also where abuse is happening. So those are some of those areas where we've seen constant change, and it's really important for our staff to stay up to date on those trends so that when someone says, this is what happened to me on this app or on this website, we can understand how that might be happening.
You had probably about a decade ago, like a cultural movement of Me Too. Did that change the conversation about sexual violence and the demand for your services?
We've seen, year over year, more and more people reaching out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline. And I think the thing about Me Too is that it's brought us to a space where there's a broader conversation in our society about sexual violence and about how sexual violence can happen. Back to that point about folks wondering, hey, is what I experienced sexual assault or was I raped? I think Me Too brought to the forefront a conversation where people were starting to understand, rape can look like this or sexual harassment can look like this. I didn't know that. And so we've certainly seen a change. And at the same time, I think a lot of these core issues around that you talked about on this podcast about victims not necessarily being believed or challenges with capacity in terms of processing rape kits and things like that. Those issues, continue despite some of the progress that we've made.
Megan, you mentioned law enforcement in your last few statements. What sort of interaction do you have with them, perhaps on a regular basis, reactive, proactive? Do you ever get called by police for training? Or maybe there's a woman in their office complaining about rape. Would they call someone from your team in? How does that work in real time with you and law enforcement?
Yeah. So the National Sexual Assault Hotline being anonymous and confidential means that when we're working with someone, we don't gather any identifying information. And so a lot of times we don't know where the person is. We don't know much about what specifics of their experience. And so our role really is as a support and as a connector. And so a lot of the conversations that we have around law enforcement are actually helping someone understand that they can report to law enforcement, what that might look like, what might happen when you report to law enforcement. Similarly, around if you want to get medical care, if you go to the hospital, here's what that might look like, and helping people understand what those choices are. And that can really be a first step to reporting and to getting medical care and all of those things that are needed for law enforcement to do your all's jobs. And so we're not as much of in a space where we're providing that information directly to law enforcement or where we're working with you all in that way. But certainly when it comes to things like if law enforcement are working with a victim or a survivor and it seems like maybe they're not comfortable sharing or they're wanting to process their experience or seek healing and support in a different way, we would always encourage law enforcement to provide the National Sexual Assault Hotline information directly to the victim or to the family member or the friend, because that can be sort of an intermediary place where someone can seek help and assistance.
If I may just add here some more, I was a police officer starting in the mid-1970s, and I learned early on to contact a group called WAR, WOAR, Women Organized Against Rape. And if we had a rape victim call us, we went to their house, whatever, we had a hotline to call. This is the old days, just landline telephones. And those, usually it's women, they would show up usually at our headquarters, maybe at a person's house, and they would sit with me, the uniform officer, a detective, the victim, and then this OAR person who was trained how to interact with these women, hold their hands, if not literally, certainly figuratively, and help out. I found those folks to be very credible, very helpful on the scene. We didn't have a whole lot of women police officers back then. And I think our younger women victims especially enjoyed, I won't say enjoyed, but they appreciated having these WOAR delegates with us, and they proved very valuable. And again, we all agree in the high 90s, reporting is accurate and legitimate, but even some of those women who were trained, they'd say, all right, I'm not sure where this one's coming from. And they were objective and they could look at every case from the evidence and nothing more than that. So I always appreciated those folks, although it sounds like RAINN is more on the victim side of things and interacting with them perhaps before and after the fact. But nonetheless, it is certainly appreciated what your organization does.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. And I definitely want to highlight the role of local sexual assault service providers who do that type of work. And so when folks first call RAINN, they'll get connected to a local type of assistance that might do things like that. So it depends on the area or the city or the county, and it looks different based on funding and different models. But often that first step is connecting with an advocate. And I would say, a really great best practice for law enforcement, just like you mentioned, Fitz, is having a good relationship with your local sexual assault service provider so that there is a person who's not law enforcement who can be there with the victim and supporting them, and who can kind of understand that both perspectives, right? Because I think what's so helpful for all of us to remember is that law enforcement's role, and you all know this much better than me, so you could probably put a finer point on it, but you're gathering facts, right? You want to understand what happened, who might have done it, where was that, all of these pieces. And the victim often wants to help with that, but also is going through their own experience of trying to figure out, like, whoa, what has happened to me? How do I feel about it? They might be dealing with pretty significant physical trauma as well as mental and emotional trauma. And so those two roles can kind of get sticky when you all are working towards the same goal, but from that different perspective. And so an advocate can be a person in the middle to help everybody navigate that in a way that mitigates some of those challenges.
Real quick, Chuck, if I can ask you, we started as rookies about the same time.
Yeah.
You in Philadelphia, me in northern suburbs of Bensalem. Were you familiar with this war group, women who would come in at rape scenes, or even the one later when you were detective? How did it work in Philly, as far as you know?
Well, so in Philly, like when I first joined up until I guess it was 1980, 81, it was still handled by the detectives, divisional detectives. So there's 8 divisional detectives, the areas, Northeast, Northwest, and the different areas. And you would bring in, a victim to a detective, and they would do an interview. I mean, like we all know, and there wasn't a lot of women detectives at that time. I think there might have been a handful by 1980, maybe 3 or 4 that I remember. And but they had a couple incidences where women had been raped and it was dismissed. Because like I said, they're handling, a burglary, a theft, a shooting. Next thing you know, they're talking to a victim, and they're talking, they would get a bad thing. So they decided to remove it and bring this, the unit in. So it became sex crimes. And then you would take the victim down there, and because they would interact with the women against rape down there. So you would be basically, you were transportation down and transportation back. And they would do all the interview and everything else. And when they first started, they used all those tools. But as we see, each year things started getting sloppier and sloppier. The zebra doesn't change its stripes. So the police department starts going, back, they get comfortable in that unit and they start going down with the jobs, not to be believed and everything. Because as Tommy McDevitt said, how do we get this bad? We don't get that bad real fast. It's a slow process, and depends on who your leader is, who your captain is. And, because they lead the ship, and wow, we really went down. So
What
we knew about those services that were out there, because we had the same thing like with mental health. We used to have the catchment centers and things like that where we could take somebody who was, instead of taking them to prison or over to a detective, you took them in and they would get treated. The problem was they get sloppy too. And the next thing you know, the cure all was to give them Thorazine, and then they would just, so that didn't work out. But that's what I remember.
One of the things that was clear when the downgrading blew up and the reporting of the downgrade blew up in Philadelphia was the shock and surprise of the advocacy groups. Now, if you go back and you look at what was going on in Fairmont versus what was going on in Center City, up in Fairmont, these community organizations were talking to Ditchkovsky and the police who were out on the street, letting them know what was going on. And if the advocacy groups, if 30% of the rapes were being classified as non-crime, I can't believe that some of those those victims, weren't trying to reach out and find a node somewhere they could grab onto and get help. Because those were big numbers. Those were, I mean, we were talking several hundred cases a year, rapes that were being classified as non-crimes. So, not only were the police kind of going to sleep in terms of handling these cases, I'm only half sympathetic to question, how did we get this bad? But the advocacy organizations were kind of missing the boat as well. And sometimes the interaction between the advocacy groups and the police, I think, gets to be a little bit too cozy. But they get to know each other because they're dealing with a common clientele. I think there just needs to be a healthy dose of skepticism on the part of the various players to make sure that when these victims come in, that they're being properly handled. It's a national problem. The Police Executives Research Forum, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, they have put together detailed outlines on how the sex crimes unit ought to be staffed, how the other staff in the departments ought to be trained, all the way from the person that picks up the 911 call through the officer that responds on the street level, how that first interview is being conducted. This is all laid out in great detail by these major police organizations, and supposedly the hierarchy buys into this stuff, but it doesn't filter down in real terms, in terms of being operationalized. And part of it, there's 18,000 police organizations in the United States. Now, you think about the big cities. You think about a city like Philadelphia. What's it have? 5,000 police officers, 6,000 police officers. I think, doesn't New York City have 20,000?
37,000.
Okay. These are massive organizations, but you get down to, Podunk, and there's 4 officers, and that's where a lot of this is going on. Megan, what kind of call volumes do you have? What happens when somebody calls and says, I have been raped, I know I've been raped, I'm not looking for a definition, I'm looking for somebody that can help me? And I know you've got to be getting those kind of calls. Every once in a while, I'll run into somebody and they'll start talking about background and what have you. And they'll find out what my background is and say, oh, well, my daughter, my niece, and can't get any traction with the police. It's ruining her life. And what can we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that's probably for a lot of us on this, when we share what our work is and what we're doing or what we've experienced, I think that's so common for someone to say, I've been through that too, or I know someone. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. What we would do in those situations, and we get calls like that, texts like that, chats like that all the time, is to connect someone with a local sexual assault service provider who can help them do that reporting or help them get to the hospital to get a sexual assault forensic exam. And so to do some of those pieces locally on the ground where that person is, and who can help them navigate all of those really difficult pieces. And that can include, if they've had challenges reporting or if they're having a difficult time getting in touch with law enforcement. Those are all things where the local sexual assault service provider can say, okay, we work with this law enforcement regularly. Here's who we should reach out to. If we have a complaint, here's how we can navigate that. And so I think it's really this for so many survivors, it can feel like they don't know where to turn or what to do if they're not getting the result they were anticipating. And so that's where a service provider can step in and fill the gap and say, okay, here's what we can do and here's what your choices are. And so I think I'm glad you brought that up too, because of course there are people who don't know that what they've experienced has a name. And then there are people who are very clear what's happened to them or their family member, and they're still hitting walls. I mean, just thinking about all of the victims that you've talked about so far on this season, there's really, Abby Bell, Cora, and Diane all reported, right? That's pretty significant because many victims don't report. And so, and they all had these different experiences of, either not being believed or having significant physical trauma and still having there be doubt about what might have happened. And so really, recognizing that that's a systemic issue that still is pervasive today is something that I think is really important for all of us to acknowledge and think about. How do we fix that? It's a big problem.
Well,
The reason,
there's other side of the coin to Abby, Bill, Cora, Diane reported. Only, what is it, 10% of the people who are sexually assaulted actually call the police and get them involved. It's a relatively low number. One has to wonder how many people Troy Graves attacked that
absolutely.
sat in the shadows and didn't call. Undoubtedly, there were several.
Well, the reason the five of us are sitting here today is because there's 4 sexual assaults in the summer of 97, all within 6 weeks of each other in locations you could walk in less than 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
And 2 aren't believed, right? They're treated like it's an investigation of persons and a burglary. And the other 2, they have a good detective on it, but the decision's made to pull the case off that detective and give it to SIU, and then nothing.
Wow.
Nothing happens. And one victim, Belle, is trying her hardest to be believed. And everywhere she runs up against, she runs into a wall till she finally meets one person who takes her serious, and they go after him. So,
right.
I mean, that's why we're sitting here. Had they done their job in those, I firmly believe that if they had done their job that first summer and linked those 4 jobs, I don't think we'd be sitting here today.
Well, let me see if I can get us back on track here, because I want to really get in with Megan's expertise and how she can help so many people out there that are listening to this show. Megan, sexual violence impacts people in a lot of different ways. Depends on who you are. It depends on where you live. How is RAINN working to reach some of these underserved and marginalized communities, if you know?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that. I think that part of RAINN's model as a national organization and as an organization where we are available to people nationwide, I think helps fill some of that gap, right? Because if you're in an area where there's not a local rape crisis center or a service provider, or there's limited resources, there's still this national place you can go. We can help you figure out what to do. I think the other broader piece of that would just be around education and awareness, helping people understand this is what sexual violence is, this is how it happens, this is what you can do about it. And so that when people do have that experience, or they know someone, a loved one, a family member, a friend who says, hey, this is what happened to me, that person can say, here's what you can do. And here's the options that are available to you. Here's how you get help. That piece around understanding what to do and also how to talk to someone who has experienced sexual violence are really crucial pieces of the puzzle. And so those are a lot of the ways that we're thinking about this. When we also talk about accessibility and making sure that anyone who reaches out to us can get help, the hotline is available in English, but also in Spanish. So for someone who might have a harder time accessing resources in English, we're available 24/7 in Spanish as well.
Well, let me, some of the things we talked about here, at least during this whole podcast this season, is the fact that when victims reach out to law enforcement, they're not believed. How does RAINN ensure that survivors feel safe and are believed the moment they reach out to you?
This is such a thoughtful question, and really the way that we think about this is what we call the person-centered and trauma-informed approach. And so person-centered means seeing everyone who connects with us as a whole person and centering their needs and their feelings and their experience in that moment. And trauma-informed means thinking about the way that trauma shows up for people in how they communicate, and in also how they might trust institutions or trust other people, or how they might share their story. And so just acknowledging that all of that is in the ether when someone shows up. And also we affirm what they're sharing. We say, I believe you. You are not alone. There is help available. This should not have happened to you. And we use all of that language because it might be the first time someone's heard that. Maybe they shared their story before and someone said, well, like, what were you wearing? Or what were you doing? Or were you by yourself at night? Or, any of these kind of victim blaming judgmental statements. And so it's important for us to be that first place for someone to hear, you're not alone, you deserve help, and help is available to you.
Now, RAINN isn't just a crisis hotline.
Correct.
You guys also work on policy change. What
Yes.
what systemic issues are you currently focused on right now?
This is a big question, and there are, of course, a lot of them. When we think about the systemic issues, we're thinking about what are the things that we need to change more broadly to address this problem.
One thing is, trying to find a balance for pushing legislative change while at the same time trying to stay survivor centered. I mean, that's a tall order. I mean, sometimes it's difficult to do both if you find that that's the case.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Sil.
There's dramatic differences in how victims are treated uh, by the police they interact with, based on the education level, the training level, the sensitivity level that the police responders have to these individuals. When we had Jim McGinnis here, he talked about when he was thrown into sex crimes. He had no background here. There was basically no training. Now, it's very different in Philadelphia now, but there's a lot of places around the country where that is still the situation. And you get some guy that's been doing burglaries who now all of a sudden is dealing with victims of sex crimes, who in the trauma of the attack, their memory has shut down, so they can't recall the details. They know physically something that has happened to them, but they can't provide details. And they come in and start telling this jumbled story to some guy who doesn't understand this. And all of a sudden, this guy's saying, "Well, your story's all screwed up. I don't believe you." Well, there's a reason the story's all screwed up. It's a physiological response to being attacked. And so you've got, people have to understand is that the cop on the street, the patrol officer who picks this victim up. I mean, you could go to New Orleans, you could go to Baltimore, read the reviews that the Justice Department has done. Quite a number of cases, the cases are being dismissed. They're being written off by patrol officers. And it's an organization within the department. There needs to be review going on of how cases are being handled. The people that are handling them have to be trained. There has to be accountability when they're not doing their job. And there's no massive overlay of organization to get this to happen. Mm-hmm. And I'm not being critical of what RAINN is doing, but they're dealing with people who are going and talking to this officer who hasn't been trained, who's not sensitive to what's going on. Megan can tell them, "I believe you. You've been attacked. I don't doubt that." But when they go get in front of this police officer who says, "Your story's not straight. I don't think it's right," what do?
Yeah. So I think that's such an important point, and also is part of how RAINN is thinking about this. Ray, you asked what's the systemic ways or policy change we're trying to make. And I think that points to this need for education and for awareness for all stakeholders involved in this crime, right? And whether that's law enforcement or hospital staff or really just like broadly the community and society and how we talk about sexual violence, because the patrol officer is living in that soup of how we talk about victims that all of us are living in, right? So if we think about how victims are portrayed in places like the media or in Hollywood and trying to figure out, how do we improve that? And those are things that RAINN is working on in terms of we work with media, we work with different, production companies to say, like, if you're going to portray sexual assault, here's how you can talk about it. Here's how you can talk about what victimhood can look like. Here's how you can share this, because all of us are showing up to our jobs within this broader society that has a certain way that we are looking and talking about sexual assault. And often that is looking for the perfect victim, someone who, didn't do anything, quote unquote, wrong in order to be believed. And so I think what you're saying makes sense, where it has to be not just training someone who's an expert in this, or not just coming to the hotline and being believed. We want to make sure that people, no matter who they disclose to, no matter where they ask for help, whether that's the police or a school teacher or a healthcare professional or someone in their community, a parent, that they get that same supportive response that they might get on the hotline. And so that's one of the areas that we're always thinking about when we do an education or awareness campaign is, how do we make sexual assault, sexual violence a problem for all of us to understand that this doesn't just impact someone in another community that you don't know, but that it could impact you, and it certainly has impacted someone in your life.
Do you think you're making any progress, Megan? Do you think society is paying attention? Is law enforcement paying attention to you? Is it working?
That's such a big question. I think yes and no. I think there is big progress being made, and there's still a long way to go. One of the policy victories that we had this year that we're really excited about is the passage of the Take It Down Act, which makes it illegal to post non-consensual intimate images, which we've previously talked about as revenge porn is maybe the word that we used to use, but non-consensual intimate image abuse is a more sort of precise way to talk about it. This law makes it illegal for that content to be posted on the internet and starts to provide a pathway for survivors to get those images taken down, and also requires social media companies to take those images down. Because in the past, what we've seen is that a victim might report to a social media company and say, hey, this picture, I didn't want it taken, a nude photo, someone posted it against my will, and they might never get a response from that social media company. And, that's a form of sexual abuse as well. And so we're really excited to see progress like that. And at the same time, we know that there are victims who are either not reaching out for help because they're afraid to do so, or we know that there are victims who are reaching out for help and maybe aren't getting the support that they need and deserve because of some of these big issues that you all have been tackling this season and in previous seasons as well. Over the last 31 years that RAINN has been in existence, we've helped 5 million people, survivors, loved ones, family members. And we know that the more people who know about us, the more people who are aware of the National Sexual Assault Hotline, who are aware of this problem, the more progress we can make. I think in order to keep showing up and doing this work, you have to believe that is possible. And so I certainly do. We've got a long way to go as well.
The thing about technology and how technology is continuing to change, have you seen new risk emerging as a result of the digital world? And how is it affecting how you do your job and affecting survivors?
I think the biggest thing is around safety and around the ways in which abusers can use the internet and can use tracking technology and look at people's internet histories and things like that in order to control them further. And so whether that's, someone posting information publicly about their location, or an abuser looking at someone's phone history or internet history to see that they've asked for help or that they've been Googling, where to get assistance. I think that's a really big risk, and also something that we always talk about on the hotline with people as a form of safety planning. Let's talk about how you can keep your devices safe. Let's talk about making sure that no one else knows your password, that you're deleting your history, that all of these pieces. And I think that beyond that, there's also just this layer of where if the internet is where someone's abuse has happened, you still need to use your device, your phone, the internet as part of your day-to-day life. And so there's this constant re-traumatization that people experience. Every time your phone dings, is this image being reshared? Is someone using the internet to abuse me? I think that's a new element, or a newer element, that keeps evolving, and that it's really important that whether it's advocates, law enforcement, all of us stay up to date as much as possible on how these technologies are being used so that we understand those different forms of abuse as they evolve and change.
I remember a case when I was a police detective in Bensalem Township, a woman who came in and reported
Speak up,
a rape.
Jimmy.
Who came in and reported a rape, and we took all her information. It was supposed to be her boyfriend who did it. At a routine procedure, we went through her wallet, and there's a Polaroid picture, so we're talking old school, of her performing a certain sexual act on this boyfriend. She said it was from the night before. We contacted the Bucks County District Attorney's Office, and they said we could never prosecute that case. And quite frankly, I was ambivalent about that. I was relatively young. She still has a right to say no a day after that picture was taken if she said it was rape. But I'm also thinking like a police officer testifying in court, and that picture comes up as evidence. So the waters can be a little muddied sometimes. And believe me, we've been through this whole season talking about the screw-ups of the Philadelphia PD, and Chuck was the first one to acknowledge them, certainly back in the 90s on these cases. Sometimes it does get a little muddy or murky, and that people above the police officer themselves are making decisions not to further prosecute or even investigate. And that's just one example. I have no doubt there are many more than that. Just throwing that out there for commentary.
Well, Meg, let me ask you this. for our listeners. If someone has been a victim and they call in to you or they call the police department, having done this for quite a while, you have, what can they expect from the time when they make that first contact with law enforcement or with you? Walk through what they would go through so they have an idea, our listeners have an idea of what a victim would actually go through.
Yeah. So when it comes to reaching out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline, I think this starts out as probably one of the more low pressure interactions, because what we're going to do is really meet the person where they are. And what that means is not physically, but mentally and emotionally, and try to understand what is it that they're sharing with us? What are they looking for? And what type of help do they want? And so from the National Sexual Assault Hotline perspective, there's going to be a lot of trying to understand what they've experienced, trying to make sure that they know, you can report, here's what that looks like. You can go to the hospital, here's what that might look like. Here are some resources around making a safety plan. So if their abuser or perpetrator is their intimate partner, a husband, a romantic partner of some kind, here's how you might stay safe if you're still in that relationship. Like really mirroring what the person needs, and also letting them know here's what you can do. Which of those do you want? And we can provide you with those local resources. What's going to look a little different is if they decide to make that connection to either go to the hospital and meet with a sexual assault nurse examiner, or if they decide to contact a local sexual assault service provider, or if they decide to contact law enforcement. Those processes are going to look really different across cities and across states or across different locations. But often what that's going to involve is meeting with an advocate, a victim advocate, or an officer, and sharing what you've experienced. And they're going to ask lots and lots of questions to try to understand what has happened. They might want to understand all the way from point A to point Z in as much chronological order as possible. And then also letting them know, that they can ask to have a victim advocate present, that they can ask for breaks, and that they can as much as possible, try to control the pace of that conversation, but that law enforcement has a really essential and important role to play. And so they are going to want to ask questions and want to understand what happened. And that might look different than, chatting and asking for help via hotline. And so here's how you can get some additional support with that. And then for the hospital, something similar, that you might have someone asking to do a forensic exam, and here's what that could look like. Here are some of your options around that. And so it's really, I think part of that trauma-informed approach is being as transparent and honest as possible with the victim about what it is that they can expect, and also what some of those unknowns are. And that they can always try to slow things down, to ask for clarification, and that it's their story and they should share at the pace that they're comfortable. So that's sort of a overarching piece, but the National Sexual Assault Hotline can be a nice starting place for folks when they're not sure what they're looking for, or when they're sure but they're nervous and they want to understand, what might it mean for me to get help in this way.
Well, let me ask you from a personal perspective, your personal perspective. If you could change one widespread misconception about sexual violence, what would it be?
Oh, that is such a good question. I think it goes back to this narrative of someone having to be the perfect victim to deserve help. When I was listening to the first couple episodes of this season, my heart was broken. I mean, my heart's broken in every episode. Still hearing your story and Shannon's experience, and just the horrific, her murder. When I think about how the narrative of the perfect victim kept us from identifying this guy and stopping him, that really just is profound for me. And so the narrative of the perfect victim is this idea that in order for someone to be believed, they have to tell their story in a way that's easy to understand. They have to be ready to tell their story right away. They have to call the police immediately. They have to go right to the hospital. They have to also be this sort of perfect person who doesn't have any past history of crime, wasn't drinking, was wearing the right outfit, wasn't out and about. In a couple of these situations, police and others had sort of said to the victim, oh, well, like maybe it was your boyfriend. Are you sure it wasn't someone you knew? And all of that can be such a barrier to someone getting help. And so if I could change something, it would be to shift that narrative to no one should experience sexual violence. No one should experience sexual assault. And certainly no one should should be murdered in the process. And when someone does have that terrible thing happen, they should be able to share their story publicly with the media, with the police, with their loved ones, with family members, and they should be believed regardless of, some of these other factors that sometimes keep us from believing people.
Is there anything that everyday people can do to support survivors and even work with RAINN?
Yeah. So we have a couple different models when we talk about supporting survivors. And the first one is the HEAL model. And this is a way to be ready to support someone who's experienced sexual violence. And the idea is to do that without judgment and without pressure. So the first is in the HEAL model is H, which stands for have resources to share. You don't have to know everything about how to help them, but you should know, where to send them or what's available. So that can look like the National Sexual Assault Hotline. That could look like a local service provider, but knowing that there's help available and saying to them, there's help available. That second letter is E, educate yourself to become trauma informed. So be prepared to, when someone shares their story with you, understand what's happening and be able to meet them with that compassion of, I believe you, you're not alone, I'm here for you. The third letter in HEAL is A, that's advocate for all survivors. And so being able to advocate for whether that's big policy reform that can help survivors, or when you hear that someone has been raped or experienced sexual violence, being able to advocate for them and give them that same care that you would give a family member or a friend. And the last letter of HEAL is L, listen to survivors, which is really being able to say the people who can most help us understand how we can do better are survivors themselves. I think you all have done an awesome job of that on this podcast of bringing survivors on and really having them share their stories and listening to what they would have needed for things to be different. So that's the HEAL model. And that's a way that we help people understand how to show up for survivors. And I think you can, even if you just want to start with that H of knowing that there's help out there and knowing what those resources are, that can be a really big first step for folks.
In 1997, the New York City Police Department acknowledged they had 17,000 untested rape kits on their evidence shelves. They had those all tested by around 2003. In 2007 or 8, there was a commission that looked into how they were handling sex assaults, and they estimated that they only had about half the staff in the police force that they needed, given the volume of crimes they were dealing with. That they had a seniority promotion process where people were being promoted into detective positions into the police department, into the sex crimes investigation unit, based on seniority and instead of their abilities to handle this kind of crime. And there was a big to-do that the department was going to clean this all up. In 2016, Inspector General did a review of the department. They were still at somewhere around half staff for handling the case volume that they had, and they were still promoting people into the sex crimes unit based on seniority instead of their background, their abilities, and their training. And there was a big to-do that they were going to clean this all up. At the end of 2024, the Department of Justice had them under review. I think they were about to take them to court order because they hadn't addressed any of these things. So somebody from New York City calls you and they're not getting properly handled. What do you tell them?
Phil, I'm really glad that you brought this up, and I'd love to talk also about the Debbie Smith Act at some point and about the backlog of rape kits and all of those pieces. But if someone reaches out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline with that concern, our goal would be to connect them with a local provider who can help them on the ground and navigate that, right?
But if the police department only has half staff, you can put them, maybe if you get a super advocate, they're going to help some of them, but they can't help all of them.
Yeah.
And I, God bless the Debbie Smith Act. But if, the reason a lot of rape kits haven't been tested is because the cases weren't being properly investigated. And the fact of the matter is, when these rape kits do get tested, the investigation rates and the prosecution rates on these older cases are extremely low. They're still not being investigated. And it's, it looks like these departments are doing something because they're now testing the rape kits. If, DA in Detroit, when they had their 12,000 or 11,000, whatever it was, rape kits tested, she said it doesn't do any good to test the rape kits if you're not going to go investigate and prosecute the cases.
Well, Phil, I can tell you from my experience, one of the main reasons why that's probably happening is because of the fact that all the work that should have been done up front wasn't done. And therefore, when it's tested and they look at it, they may have this, but they don't have the work up front to be able to move forward with it.
Think about Memphis, 12,000 rape kits.
Mm-hmm.
They were understaffed before they discovered the 12,000 rape kits. So they go out and start testing these rape kits, and they bring them in and they dump them on a already overbooked staff. They're still not. You're absolutely right. But at some juncture, first of all, you have to have the right people in these investigation staffs. You have to train them. You have to hold them accountable. And we're not willing to do that on any kind of. The Debbie Smith Act is a national program to pour money into testing rape kits, but there's no requirements that they do anything once they get the rape kit tested. I've talked to the
this is something I want to really talk about this in depth when we come back on next time. So I think this is a topic that should just be one whole episode that we talk about, and talking about some of these. We really, really should.
Yeah.
Ray, do we have some questions from some listeners?
Say again, Jim?
Do we have some questions from some listeners?
As a matter of fact, I believe we do. Here's some questions for you. I'm going to read these to you, Megan. In filtering through the audience questions, we noticed the I in RAINN mentioned quite a bit. Would you provide us with some numbers regarding how prevalent incest is with American families? Is it more prevalent with male or female victims? More prevalent with male or female abusers?
So when we're talking about incest, a lot of times we have been using language in recent years that we say sexual abuse or sexual assault by a family member, because I think that can often be more easily understood by folks. And when we think about that, what we know is that 93% of victims under 18 know their abuser. And of that, 34% of the abusers were family members. So it is unfortunately very common for the abuse to be taking place within a family. And that can make it even more difficult for people to ask for help, because the person abusing them maybe is a trusted person in their life, or even if the victim doesn't trust the abuser, other people around them do. And so they're afraid to ask for help and not sure what will happen, or afraid no one will believe them. So more of those issues that we've talked about. When it comes to the gender or the sex of the victims, this is a little bit harder to put a number on. We know that 82% of all victims under age of 18 are female. And so we can make some assumptions about in cases of incest that this is happening primarily to girls. But we also know, and we want to be really clear, that boys and men also experience sexual violence and sexual abuse. And that includes by family members, whether that's by a parent or another relative, or even, expanding past familial abuse, other forms of sexual violence. Men and boys can be victims as well. And there can be kind of different barriers to reaching out for assistance for men and boys.
Well, thank you. And here's, I have 4 more questions. I'll throw these out to you. Can you speak to the concept of delayed disclosure or delayed reporting? Why is it so common? And what are the best ways for loved ones and support systems to respond when a survivor comes forward years later?
So delayed reporting is often happening for some of those same reasons that we're talking about other big issues with getting victim support. So one of the big ones is trauma. When someone is processing their own experience, they might not remember all of the details in a linear way, or they might remember some of the details at a later time. And so sort of all the puzzle pieces come together, and that's when they're ready to report or share. Or maybe they are fully clear what they experienced, but that trauma is making it difficult for them to ask for help. They could be in shock and not really be able to articulate what happens. They might be kind of in that freeze trauma response state. Another barrier, another reason we might have delayed disclosure is stigma, a real fear of being judged by their family members, by their friends, by their coworkers, and not wanting to open themselves up to that. And a last one would be not knowing where to report or what to do. And this might be, okay, well, if I go to the police, what will happen? Will they believe me? That kind of thing, or just not knowing like logistically what to do. And then that last piece is what we've talked about earlier, is this question of, is what I experienced actually rape? Did I get sexually assaulted, or was it something else? Or, well, he's my boyfriend. And so, although I said no, he's my boyfriend, maybe that's not actually assault. So that sort of self-questioning that can be so common. I think the best thing for loved ones to do is, and I'm going to reiterate this again, is to be able to be there for someone, even if there's a delay, and not to say, well, why didn't you tell me when that happened? But to say, I'm so glad you're telling me now. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Let's figure out a plan. I'm here for you.
Great answer. Here's a question that it's actually a pretty interesting question. How common is marital rape, and how are those cases treated?
I would definitely defer to you all on how law enforcement treats those cases and what that can look like. But it's definitely a common form of sexual violence. And where this is happening with intimate partners, I think it's important to know that this isn't just forced intercourse or rape. It can really involve anything in that marital relationship or that intimate partner relationship where there's not consent or there's not bodily autonomy. And this is a really important piece of the conversation. And so the core of that is consent. And we have a lot of information on our website kind of detailing what that can look like. And this can be, there's a barrier to reaching out for help in the case of marital rape or intimate partner sexual violence because of that idea, like, well, this person is my partner, and so will anyone believe that there was actually abuse happening? What I will say is I think in recent years, we're getting more and more clear that there can be abuse happening in that relationship, whereas 20, 30 years ago, I think there was a lot less of a public awareness that this could be a problem. So certainly is something that happens, and certainly is a form of sexual violence, regardless of who the person is to you, a stranger or someone that you know, or even someone that you might love.
Great. And here's the question now. This is a question that came in from the audience. I had nothing to do with this question, but I'm going to read it as it's written. My partner and I often engage in rough sex, but lately it's been too much. Where is the line drawn in this situation?
I'm really glad this person asked this question. And I would say that the key here is where they say, lately it's been too much. That tells me that for them, this is not a situation where they're consenting or they feel like they have a choice. And so I would really, really urge them to, if they're ready to, and sounds like they might be because they're ready to ask this question, to reach out for help. That could be to the National Sexual Assault Hotline. It could be to a trusted person in their life. But no one that you are in a relationship with should be engaging in sex acts with you in a way that you're not comfortable with, in a way that you haven't said yes to. That consent piece and that choice piece are really, really crucial. And if that's not being respected, you can get help. Help is there.
That's great advice. Thanks, Megan. And the last question. Hearing the stories of the survivors from the Center City Rapist case has been incredibly powerful. As a listener who wants to support survivors in my own life, what can I do to be helpful and supportive? What should I absolutely avoid doing or saying?
This is great. A really good question and very thoughtful. Think we've talked a lot about what you should do. I'll talk a little bit about some of the phrases that might not be so affirming for people that we might want to avoid. Asking like, hey, are you sure that's what happened? Or did that really happen? That might make the person feel like you don't believe them, especially if there's been a delayed disclosure. Well, like, why didn't you report it? Why didn't you tell someone? Why didn't you fight back? Like anything that's putting judgment on what the person did or didn't do. What were you wearing? That gets back to that victim blaming that we've touched on quite a bit. And then in a scenario where maybe the person, the survivor, you all know the abuser, saying, oh, well, they seemed really nice, or I didn't think he would ever do that, or I didn't think she would ever do that. Anything where you're sort of invalidating that person's experience because you know the perpetrator and you think, well, I didn't think he would do that. And instead of those types of statements, focusing on being supportive of the person, of what they're sharing, thank them for telling you, and be there as a continued support, not just in that first moment, but in their whole journey of getting help and healing.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Jim?
I think Megan's answered all my questions.
Megan,
great job, Megan.
Is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners that we haven't asked you about?
I think we've covered the whole gamut. I'm sure I'll think of something when I hop off, but for now, I think we've really gotten to the heart of it, and I appreciate you having me on.
Well, Megan, thank you for sharing your insight and the work you and your team are doing every day to ensure survivors are heard, believed, and supported. I think it's just amazing work, and I'm so happy that we can support your organization any way that we can.
Likewise, thank you all for the important conversations you're having and the advocacy you're doing, and still the advocacy you're doing for your daughter and her legacy is just really admirable. So I'm just honored to be here with all of you and have this conversation.
Megan, since our third episode, we've been signing out the same way each time with a PSA. I'm going to do it right now in your presence, if that's okay. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual assault, you are not alone. RAINN, that is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, has a national sexual assault hotline that offers free, confidential 24/7 support in English and in Spanish. Call 800-656-HOPE. That's 800-656-4673, where you can chat at hotline.rainn, RAINN.org, or text HOPE to 4673. I think after hearing Megan in this episode, folks out there, you'd be even more interested in contacting this number if any of these issues are present. So again, everyone out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Cold Red. Please like us, subscribe to us, check out our website, coldredpodcast.com. Thanks to our producers, Matt McLaughlin, Matt Robinson, our music director, Rick Schilling, and for Ray and me and Chuck and Sil, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time on Cold Red.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Megan.
Oh, thank you all.